So in our last session, I raised the question: what we know that there's this comparison that's going to be made between Jesus and Adam. It begins in verse 12, as we can see right here. Verse 12 starts with just as sin came into the world, and then there's no so that finishes out that comparison. You have to go way down to verse 18 to reach the point where you see there's an as followed by a so. Just as Adam did this, so Jesus did this. Verse 19, just as Adam's disobedience did this, so Jesus' disobedience did that. So that's the comparison. It doesn't finish in verses, in the one begun here in verse 12 never finishes. And we notice that verse 15, where you'd think the comparison would resume, it doesn't resume. And so I asked the question, what's going on here in this paragraph? But let's just step back again and note our map. That here, in chapters 1 to 5, where you had this problem of sin and the problem particularly of our guilt and how we're under God's wrath, that chapters 1, 2, 3 to the middle of 3 are all focused on making the case of the problem of sin, that we're guilty. In other words, Paul has to present a fairly lengthy argument to show us that all of humanity is guilty. But when you get to this section here, the second section of the book, and he begins to talk about the second problem associated with human sin, the corruption that leads to death, you'll notice he only has to spend a couple of verses. It's actually just these few verses here, verses 12 to 14, is where he makes this assertion. It's a very small amount of space. And why is that? Well, the reason is because whereas people might disagree with Paul about whether we're guilty sinners before God, and he has to make his case there, nobody can really disagree that sin is corrupting and leads to death, because after all, everybody dies. And there's lots of negative consequences we see every day in our lives and the lives around us of how sin leads to death even in the living. So he doesn't really have to spend a lot of time making a case for that. He just needs to announce the problem. And then the rest of this introduction is not so much on trying to make the case that sin is corrupting, but instead is simply showing right off the bat that there is hope, that whereas Adam, his corruption has spread to all people, so there's hope that through Jesus there's a salvation, a deliverance from this corruption. We can enter into holiness, practical, real, in the flesh, in our boots, in our hands, real daily holiness, and we can begin to be delivered from sin now. All right, so what is this paragraph here, verses 15 to 17, about? Well, notice how the wording isn't the wording of comparison, but of contrast. He says the free gift is not like the trespass. And verse 16, the free gift is not like the trespass, not like the result of that one man's sin. So this idea of contrast, that's what verses 15 to 17 are about, contrast. Why contrast? Well, because before Paul begins to make this comparison between Adam and Jesus and show that there's some analogy between them, he wants to make sure we understand, before he even gets there, that there is a massive contrast which is altogether to the benefit and to the advantage of what Jesus has done. Because obviously what Jesus did has saved the world, has provided a salvation anyway for the whole world. And that shouldn't be lost on us as he begins to make this comparison. The comparison gives us hope, but the contrast gives us even greater hope, which is why the end of this comparison and contrast is that he says that where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. That the law came in to increase the trespass. The law came in like a thermometer to tell us that we're sick. But grace, what Jesus did, has in other words, the law is a thermometer that tells us, yes, as a result of being born the descendants of Adam, we are sick. And it's clarity. We really are sick. It's not just we feel like we have a fever. The law is like a thermometer. You can actually look at the numbers and see we are indeed, we have a fever. And then the grace abounds all the more through Christ as opposed to what Adam did. Okay, so that brings us then to chapter 6. And now we get a pattern which is fairly easy to follow as you go through, so the questions will be fairly predictable. You can anticipate a lot of them. And that is, you're going to get a question. What shall we say? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? And the answer is going to come back, by no means. And what follows is the answer to the question. Okay? Down here is the answer, and here, up here, is the question. Okay? And so, I have a simple question. What is the question, and how does the answer the question? And then once that's done, okay, that's going to be verses 1 to 14. That's going to be what you're going to think about for the next time. But notice the pattern. After that, you're going to get another question. What then? Are we to sin because we're not under law but under grace? And the answer is going to come after that. Verses 15 all the way into chapter 7. And then look what's going to happen in chapter 7, verse 7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? And the answer is going to come here, for a ways anyway. And then you're going to get another question. Did that which is good then bring death to me? And you get the answer. So we're not going to try and worry about all of those. I'm just showing you the pattern. What you're going to worry about for next time is just verses 1 to 14. Okay? Verses 1 to 14. What's the question and what is the answer? And then I'm going to give you one other little challenge in the midst of that. It's a key to understanding the answer to the problem, so that's why I'm raising this, which is this thing here, verse 11. It says, "So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus." And I want to know, what exactly does that mean? I'm supposed to consider myself dead to sin. Well, I don't feel dead to sin. I doubt you feel dead to sin. So what does it mean we're to consider ourselves dead to sin? It sounds like we're supposed to play a mental game, like we pretend or we try to mentally convince ourselves we're dead to sin when in fact temptation is raging inside of us. Well, is that what Paul means? So if not, what does he mean? So that's the other question you can take up. So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.